Hello everyone, I'm Abebe Selassie, head of the IMF's African department, welcoming you to Africa Perspectives, where we discuss pressing economic policy issues facing regional leaders. It is my great pleasure today to welcome Professor Carlos Lopes, an honorary professor at Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance. He is also affiliate professor at Sciences Po, Paris, associate fellow at Chatham House, London, foundation fellow at the International Science Council, Paris, and senior visiting fellow at the Overseas Development Institute, London. Professor Lopes has had a distinguished career. As a UN career official, he served as Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa between 2012 and 16. This high-level position crowned a sterling career in the organization that also included several positions such as UN representative in Zimbabwe and Brazil, Director of Policy at the UNDP, Executive Director of the UN Institute for Training and Research, Director of the UN Staff College, and Political Director for Secretary General Kofi Annan. Professor Lopes has taught at universities and academic institutions across the world and has given lectures in leading universities in over 30 countries. He was appointed as the Africa Union High Representative for Partnerships with Europe in 2018 and member of the African Union Reform Team led by President Paul Kagame in 2017. Professor Lopes has actively contributed to research and development issues, specialized in development and strategic planning. He has authored and edited more than 20 books with a focus on African economies. His book, called Africa in Transformation, Economic Development in the Age of Doubt, is, in the words of the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, a compelling rethink of traditional development models in Africa and the need to seize on transformational change to build sustainable future for the continent. Today, we hope to delve into these issues with Carlos. Carlos, thank you so much for joining us for this session today. Really one of the sessions that I've been looking most forward to. So if I may,
thank you.
If I may, Carlos, just as a general kickoff, you have been characterizing Africa, or your blog has been called the Africa Cheetah Run. Can you please explain to our audience what it is that you mean by this? What the African cheetah for you conveys, if we could start with that.
Well, it's an image that tries to catch the attention of people about the comparisons that have been made during the Africa Rising period of the beginning of this century with the Asian tigers. And, it's a way of me metaphorically demonstrate that if we do like the lions, it will be a lot of show off. It will be short-lived. It's not based on strategy. The rate of efficiency for the lions is very low. It's not gender sensitive because most of the lions actually don't do much. The lionesses do the work, although they are the first to eat and are very territorial, and they dispute amongst males for the territory in a way that is very similar to the big man leadership style that we have been accustomed to in Africa. The cheetah is all the opposite. The cheetah first is the equivalent of the most efficient in terms of its capacity to adjust. It's very strategic, doesn't go for anything unless there are 80% chances of succeeding. Very focused, team builder, no gender disparities in the work, and more importantly, the cheetah is the fastest animal on earth. And because I want to symbolize that Africa is in a catch-up that has to be so fast and faster than anybody else, basically Africa needs a cheetah behavior rather than a lion's behavior.
That's fantastic, fantastic. In the way you brought out both the imagery, which I'm, often kind of always a little bit in two minds whenever, our continent with all its diversities compared to one animal or another. But I think the cheetah may be one which I too will coin, and I like particularly the fact that it's not that there's a lot more gender equality among the cheetah population. But if I may, Carlos, I mean this phrase you coined as there was a big growth outbreak in the region, and many more countries were growing a lot more rapidly. Yeah? In light of more recent developments, where we've seen in some cases, growth taking a tumble. Would you say, again, it's difficult to generalize, of course. Have we been, have countries indeed been running like cheetahs? Or the expectation that they would continue to run like cheetahs, has that been disappointed in light of recent developments?
I'm, of course, very optimistic in looking into the half of the glass that appeals for transformation. But it is very clear that we have not been very successful in structural transformation of the African economies as much as I want. But this being said, I think there is a number of developments that we should celebrate. But the historical dimensions that are behind Africa's faith cannot be underestimated. Commodity dependency has become very much linked to our interpretation of comparative advantage theory, and we need to revisit the way Africans have been cornered into considering that this was really the way their economies should be defined, and that's very, very much a colonial model. Adding value is, of course, one way of dealing with this phenomena, but more importantly, if we look into the political economy that is behind this situation, we can despair of the fact that most of the regulatory frameworks that have been put in place over time, particularly on trade, have not been favoring Africa. And we are seeing another wave of the same, with the implications coming from the environmental concerns and climate change in particular, and the way we are starting to tax carbon and dealing with carbon with regulatory systems that do not favor Africa. So it's a very long battle. And I think what is actually optimistic about it is the fact that the countries that are progressing the most are not necessarily the ones that have a natural resources bounty, demonstrating that we have to revisit a bit the models that we have followed in the past.
Indeed, indeed. I will come to kind of, this distinction that we've seen in the performance of commodity-dependent countries versus non-commodity dependent countries. But I just want to explore a little bit more the growth outcomes that we've seen in recent years, the macroeconomic outcomes we've seen in recent years. Of course, one set of factors has been the global shocks, the pandemic, war in Ukraine, commodity price volatility, tighter financing conditions as a result of monetary tightening in many advanced countries. But how much is it also self-inflicted? What do I mean here? I mean, did our policymakers take their eye off the prize? If you could say a little bit about how you see. I just hesitate always to be looking at external causes for some of the economic weaknesses we've seen. And what do you think is the balance?
I think, of course, the external dimensions are important, but there is a lot of self-inflicted pain. First, I don't think there is justification for us not to have a more productive agriculture. The kind of yields per hectare that we still have in the continent as an average are extremely low, and this is something that is a bit difficult to explain just because of the external factors, because it is an area where basically governments could have done quite well without much interference from the outside, and they haven't. Of course, I also believe that the way we have administered taxes has been extremely inefficient. I also believe that it is very important for us to revisit the way we manage our savings, particularly pension funds and other opportunities that we have in the continent that are not really creating productive use of savings, which is really a pity. And we could have learned lessons from Asia in that regard. Just to look into the closest in terms of structural transformation, historically speaking. So I do think that there are lots of reasons that can be identified for inefficiencies in the way we have set our political systems that are very predatory towards the use of resources for an elite, and that's basically rent-seeking behavior. And I like actually to typologize African countries in two categories, the rent seekers and the reformists. And I hope the day will come where the reformists will be the majority.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Unpacking quite a few things that we've touched on. So maybe we can start by kind of thinking a little bit about, because you brought up agriculture, and I do also think that the progress that has been developed, quite disappointing over the years. And I'm not sure, I can never really put a finger at what may be behind this. What do you think is the reason why the political economy has been against more investment in agriculture? And I see kind of, yes, there is, at a grand level, some distinction between how economic outcomes have evolved in commodity-dependent countries and others. But in agriculture, my sense is, even the more diversified countries have not done as well as they could have. So what is it about the political economy of agriculture, about agriculture investment that has not played in favor of more resources being allocated there?
Obviously, it's a combination of factors, but I think the most important factor has been that if you have a rent-seeking behavior and you have one source of revenue that is responsible for most of your budget build-up, you kind of neglect the other parts of the economy. And this has been happening many times in Africa, where, an oil-rich country or a mining-rich country basically lives out of the proceeds coming from that particular commodity and doesn't look too much into the rest of the economy. We have examples that are quite striking, like in the case of Nigeria, where the fiscal pressure is so low because basically the government doesn't look into the details of the rest of the economy as much as it looks into the oil revenues. Angola would have been another example, and so on and so forth. And because of that, there is a bit of neglect on the agricultural possibilities and hopes. The second factor that I think is important, of course, is the pressure for soft commodities as the solution for agricultural productivity, which has entangled some countries that are quite rich in terms of potential for agricultural development into going more for soft commodities than they would for the remaining opportunities offered by the primary sector. And the third factor is that we actually have been, from a political standpoint, putting agriculture in competition with industrialization. And I think this is the most stupid argument, an economist will tell you, but that's what the politicians go for. And they think that the minister in charge of industrial sector is going to be the minister in charge of industrialization. And the minister in charge of agriculture is going to be responsible for agricultural development. Obviously, the two are entangled, and there are no examples historically where you have a huge growth of productivity in agriculture without degrees of industrialization, because it's about establishing value chains and creating opportunities that don't exist with subsistence farming and the sort of technological developments that have prevailed in most of Africa.
Thank you. Very true in many respects. One issue that you also mentioned earlier is disappointment with how taxes have evolved, and even now you mentioned the low tax pressure, particularly in commodity exporting countries. My own sense is like that has been a particularly acute weakness. A lot of investment in infrastructure, in human capital in many of our countries over the last 15, 20 years, but not enough being done to capture the rate of return on all of this investment through the tax system, leading to part of the debt pressure that we've seen in debt servicing pressure we've seen in our countries. Again, there seems to me kind of quite a bit of political economy factors rather than technical factors holding back greater tax mobilization in our countries. And of course, these resources are needed exactly to be able to undertake investments from rural roads to electricity to help unlock greater structural transformation. Do you agree with this fairly sweeping assessment that I'm making, or you think it's just part and parcel of early state formation that tax mobilization is not going to be so easy?
No, I think I agree with most of what you said. With just one major qualification is the fact that a lot of the tax pressures being so, a lot of reasons for tax pressures being so low have to do with the way the economy is structured, where external obligations take precedence over internal dimensions, and it is done in such a way that basically you believe in most cases that investments are going to be attracted because you lower the taxes or you exempt the different economic agents. So a lot of the taxes that would have been paid by the major corporations in Africa are not paid. Then you don't have efficient management of BEPS, base erosion and profit shifting. So those are important. But all the other dimensions that you referred are also equally important, and they have not been addressed properly. So it would be unfair to just blame the external reasons for the situation that we find ourselves in. I like to say, as a provocation to the leaders I talk to, that if they think that raising taxes is a problem for the poor, is because they don't understand progressive taxation. What is really happening in Africa is that in most cases you have the informality of the rich that is also translated into them profiting from the situation and not paying the taxes that are due. If they have a certain degree of consumption that is sometimes outrageous in relation to the levels of poverty at a given country, is because they don't pay enough taxes, and this is because there is this degree of informality. A way of addressing the issue of taxation for me is to make it a bit more imperative for everybody to understand that we need to formalize economic transactions. And that is a much bigger structural issue, Abe, because you will need to have everybody with civil registration. You will need to have proper land tenure systems. You will need to have national accounts up to date. So it's basically managing a country with the modernity that is required. So we reduce the informality, and that is going to contribute indirectly or directly to a higher level of taxation.
I really love the phrase informality of the rich, because often when we're having discussions about the need to improve tax collection, argument that some authorities make is that the informal sector is too large and very difficult to tax. But what you're highlighting is that it's actually the formal, the known businesses, the large businesses that are not paying their fair share rather than the informal sector. But is this a technical problem which you're painting, which you're suggesting, basically that digitalization, more transparency can address, or more of a political problem? And I ask this because more and more of our countries are more boisterous democracies, no? And that would normally lend itself to progressive tax systems and going a bit more after the rich. At least that's what we've seen in many other parts of the world.
Well, I think it's a political problem because, but it's not just a political problem provoked by the leaders in Africa. It's also the result of the narratives about the continent. We need to change those narratives profoundly, and they will then in turn create opportunities for real transformation. I'm going to be a bit more specific. So during the colonial times, basically there were two regimes from a legal standpoint, where a certain part of the population, mostly the settlers and the people they co-opted, would have citizen rights, and the rest will be treated as subjects. Mm-hmm. This theory was first put together by a political scientist from Nigeria named Peter Eke. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And he has created really a theory that is very easy to pick as an explanation for what happens after countries become independent. There is a temptation to continue to treat one part of the population as citizens and the rest as subjects. And therefore, you don't need to actually create the political opportunity for all, but rather create the opportunities for those who are going to consolidate power and the elite. And this, in turn, translates into the way you handle taxes. You handle taxes in a way that is basically to comfort the elite, and you think that the rest should just be ignored. And as a result, they don't have civil registration, they don't have an ID. And you after that, all these things are not in place. You blame informality for all your fortunes, but in fact you have created the situation in the first place. Because if there is one priority that countries should have, is to have all its citizens registered. Otherwise, it means that one large proportion of the African population, is estimated at 40%, can actually live and die without any formal transaction because they don't have an ID. And this is exactly what is happening in Africa. When I say there are some responsibilities that are also outside, is because the pressure should be for countries to prioritize this type of situations rather than just elections. You'll see countries spending hundreds of millions of dollars doing electoral registry for an election, and at the same time you will not have the funding for these countries to actually have a proper civil registration that will take care of the elections, but much more.
Very, very interesting and provocative. Indeed, I mean, something that has absolutely a lot of truth in it. Changing gears a bit, Carlos, one of the big issues we're struggling with at the moment, of course, is macroeconomic imbalances having increased quite a bit. As I said earlier, part of it, I think, definitely, is on account of domestically induced, policy-induced, if you will. I mean, countries were not exactly expecting the pandemic, etc., and were running large deficits, not doing enough to collect taxes, etc. But the end result, I think, a combination of both this policy-induced part, but also exogenous shocks, has been quite a few countries getting into acute macroeconomic difficulties. Now, I also have a little bit of a feeling that maybe we took macroeconomic policy rectitude for granted. I think in the 90s, a lot of reforms were pursued and a lot more attention was being paid to making sure that, macroeconomic imbalances remained contained. But we've drifted a little bit away from that. The late Benno used to say that, all the hard work, the late Benno Ndulu, Professor Benno Ndulu, governor of the Bank of Tanzania, one of the leading, thinkers on macro issues in recent decades in our continent, used to make this point to me. Can I just ask you to give me your perspective on this?
Well, I think the exogenous shocks are the number one factor that has created the current crisis. But structurally speaking, you should use the good times to do the reforms. And unfortunately, a lot of the reforms that were required were not done during the periods of largesse that we lived in the first decade and a half of this century. But this being said, I think the number one problem that Africa is facing right now is access to liquidity. It's even more important than the problem of debt, and it's, of course, one provokes the other. But access to liquidity historically has been responsible for growth and development in any other region of the world, and Africa is really in a situation where it doesn't have access to even, the smallest periods, the smallest levels in periods of constraint and difficulties in other regions. So we really have very little access. We are the least funded economies in the world. And, any exogenous shocks immediately has repercussions that we have recognized in other parts of the world, but not as severe as in Africa for this very reason. The second very important structural problem that we face is the fact that, when we look into all the changes that are going to occur as a result of climate change imperatives and also geopolitical tensions, Africa would have been really positioned in a situation to benefit from some of these developments, but is being constrained because of this access to capital at a crucial time. And, this has a name, is climate finance, which is a lot of promises and very little delivery, under delivery, has been the norm. And I think we have to really shift gears in terms of how we look into the continent, not only because of the possibilities offered by climate change, but for a number of other reasons, including demographic. This is going to be a gigantic tectonic shift. And I think people are underestimating what the demographic shifts are going to provoke. It's not just a matter of replacing with automation, robotization. It's a lot of other things. It's about consumption. It's about tech-intensive products and processes requiring younger populations. It's about making sure that we have new models of care for aging populations that are going to have lots of money and means to afford, but will require humans to be part of the equation.
Thank you, Carlos. Very insightful. Let me just to unpack these things a bit. So, this point that you made about the liquidity squeeze that the region has been facing, and it's the effect that it has had in exacerbating debt vulnerabilities is one we've been making quite a bit also. Here's the challenge. Of course, institutions like mine have stepped forward to provide funding like never before, honestly. We really have tried to do as much as we can. Absolutely scope for us to do more still. But even as we are providing more financing, what we're seeing is other sources of financing, in part making up for drying up of other sources of financing. And here I'm speaking, of course, about the decline in aid flows, official financing, concessional financing that our countries used to rely on to finance development. And as I look, and this is not unlike the title of your book about economic development in the age of doubt. There's a lot of doubt about the whole development financing business, I think, or certainly a lot of doubt about ODA. How do we change this narrative? How do we make the case for more support to our countries, for development, much less for the climate challenge that our countries are facing?
For a while, Abe, the reasons people were keen on ODA and there was a growth of ODA was linked to the interpretation of ODA as being transformative and also being linked more and more to efficiency. You remember the debates about aid effectiveness. And I think people have lost trust in these two elements, that it is transformative and also that it is effective. And I think as a result, we have seen a decline of ODA over the years. It has accelerated over the last 2 years because of Ukraine, because a lot of the funds that are normally allocated to ODA are now being redirected to Ukraine, although they are counted as ODA. And I think we are really in a situation that is of doubt. We always associated that if the IMF has a program with a country and is giving support to that country, it's sort of a ticket for others to also jump in. And this is not happening as much now as it used to. It is a situation that is changing. And I think it is very important for us to be able to basically make sure that we are going to enter a new phase where, people are talking about hybrid financing, but I think it's more about how we are going to address the carbon markets. Because I think if you look into what has happened historically in the world, we know that those who have benefited from the current levels of development that we have also accumulated a carbon deficit or carbon debt. And those who have not as much as the Africans have a carbon credit. Now, how do we translate this very easy to understand concept into a mechanism that would allow for Africans to actually access the liquidity that will make possible for them to be a key player in the transformation and the transitions that have to occur because of climate is the key ingredient that is going to give an impetus to replace the interpretations of ODA that we grown accustomed to.
So what you seem to be suggesting is that there was at once, a little while ago, a technocratic promise that aid will deliver development, and it was on that basis that resources are being directed. But now we have to shift to invoking other arguments like this, the point you're making about climate change. Our countries are being impacted despite not having contributed to global warming. But is that going to be any easier to invoke, because the capital or the development and all of its benefits has accrued to one side of the ledger, and what is going to entice it to move to the other side of the ledger, to our countries?
Survival, the urgency linked to climate, and I think it's going to become more and more obvious.
But is that survival necessarily linked to sending money? I mean, pushing capital to the region rather than investing it here to for climate mitigation or adaptation in the advanced world, or
Well, that is the current proposition. That is the current proposition. But the returns are going to be smaller and smaller. And for any investment that you make on renewable energy transition, for instance, in the rich world, and what you make in Africa, the returns in Africa are much higher. And that sort of economic reasoning is going to sink in. It's not yet there because of the way we are dealing with carbon markets. But we'll have to revisit the way we are dealing with carbon markets. And the pressure is already building up. There is a lot of unsatisfaction in the way, sort of intermediaries are milking most of the profits in the carbon markets. There is a need for us to revisit the regulatory frameworks that are behind the way we are going to deal with carbon taxation. Otherwise, we are going to have a battle of jurisdictions where the mighty basically battle with each other for sort of their particular interpretation to prevail. And I think all of this is going to be living some sort of a backlash. We have seen it in COP28. We are seeing it more with sort of the fact that the Africans are becoming more and more interested in participating in international negotiations, and they are demonstrating their agency more and more. I think we are really living a transition.
Thanks, Carlos. Actually, this is a good way to segue to what Africans can do to elevate their voice even more. Huh? I think your work, your writings were some of the first to invoke the need for AU to be represented at the G20, much as the European Union had. You're one of the earliest advocates. It has really been really satisfying to see this coming to fruition. Huh? So kudos on having taken the mantle on this, Carlos. So two questions here. So first is, what if any changes do you think this will precipitate? And then second, how is it that we can use this fora more effectively to, put on the agenda the kind of economic questions that need to be addressed by the international financial community for a better, more prosperous world?
Abe, I was very much involved with Agenda 2063 drafting. And the process was very similar to what we are going to live now with the G20, where there is a bit of celebratory mood that has to be followed with hard work. And, you need to be sure that you translate what looks like a conquest into something that is tangible and meaningful. And the way we did it with the Agenda 2063 was to try to identify what is the entry point that is going to make a difference, like a flagship. And that is the Continental Free Trade Area. Now, for the G20, I think the big ticket is going to be how we address the issues I just raised, how Africa is going to be able to be considered a key player, not because of the size of its economy, but because of the size of the opportunities it offers for the transitions that the world has to go through, particularly climate-related ones. But I wouldn't discard even technological ones, because, we know that you need a young population for creativity. You need a younger population to be able to actually have the consumption patterns that are going to emerge. I mentioned the fact that tech-intensive is not really for old people. And the aging is going to accelerate. So, Africa should be in this fora and other like the G20 for that reason, because it's very much part of the unlocking the future. And it's a future of opportunities where Africa is just going to benefit as much as the others.
Indeed. I mean, I often use this phrase that the 21st will be the African century, exactly because of the demographic transition that's unfolding. And I still believe that very, very strongly. Yeah? But one thing that, at basically moments when economic conditions get difficult that make me wonder a bit, though, is how we can realize this dividend. What is it that we can of course always look to others to support us, but what is it internally that we have to do to make sure that we realize this dividend? We have a lot of agency, as Africans, as and people that talk to policymakers a fair bit. What is it that you think that needs to be done more to take things forward?
Well, I'm in the field of education, trying to transmit to the new generation some of the learnings of my generation. And if we look into the metaphor of the flying geese, and you try to understand what we can learn from our Asian countries' experience, it's very clear that the demographic dividend was possible because of a combination of factors in Southeast Asia that had to do a lot with investing on education and human capital. So that is still valid. Africa will have to do that homework. We have to do a better job of the way we deal with education and building human capital, no doubt. But the same way as we are going to live the last demographic transition, which is what the demographers call, when you reach a peak in terms of fertility rates and you start going down. As we are the last ones to go through that curve, and we are going to have it at a time where the rest of the world is aging. We are also going to deal with the demographic dividend at the time where the world is now becoming more and more exposed to artificial intelligence. So we cannot just do like before. It's going to be a very different equation for these two very major structural reasons. And I think it is possible for Africa to harness the benefits of this combination of factors, but it's also possible that we may fail miserably. So the jury's out. It depends very much on political choices and how Africans are going to exercise their agency. And it has to start with the way the Africans negotiate their way in terms of, the transformations that are already occurring, including the ones that have to do with, basically the instruments and tools that are going to define the regulatory systems of the future.
Thanks. So you mentioned artificial intelligence. A lot of excitement about that these days, of course. Since middle of last year, I think this is being characterized as something that is epochal. In terms of the effects that it could have on economies, on society. So one question here. All of the technological improvement that we've seen to date through history, and I want to pick this incredible historian that you are, has tended to be. All of this technology has been a complement rather than a substitute to labor, right? Of course, there have been sectors that have where U.S. agriculture comes to mind, where from 65-70% of the labor force being involved in rural areas and agriculture, now down to 2%. So there have been sectoral effects, but economy-wide, technology has been a complement and has not displaced labor fully. So the question I have is, do you see AI interfering with the point you were making earlier about Africa being the source of incremental labor force growth and resulting in more consumption, more investment possibilities in our continent? Do you see AI being a threat to that going forward, or as previous technologies, it will be more of a complement to labor?
Well, my take on that is basically to say what you described has been translated into regimes of intellectual property that protected the value of creation in a certain way. And artificial intelligence basically disrupts that model and disrupts it so significantly that you are competing with machines that are capable of basically using intellectual property knowledge that has been created without you being able to basically penalize them for it. So you will penalize other types of economic activity, but you will not be able to actually apply the same for intellectual property because of artificial intelligence. And this creates an opportunity for Africa. Why? Because up to now, if you are a latecomer, which is the case of most African countries, you did not benefit from the intellectual property regimes that are in place. With artificial intelligence, there is a chance you may, because it's disrupted. And you can be, for a variety of reasons, a beneficiary of this disruption if you do the right things. For instance, we have not explored completely the reasons why services are increasing in value much more than actually in the real economy. And we know it's because of the intellectual property. So in the future, I think a lot of this is going to be available to the Africans almost at no cost. It's true that you can also identify in the way artificial intelligence is being built the mechanisms that would allow for control to be exercised. Mm-hmm. It's through taxonomy, it's through the codes, it's through the way you are going to register certain types of essential elements for it to operate, like the chips. But I think this is going to be a battle that will be lost in no time because artificial intelligence will be able to basically identify the weaknesses that wouldn't allow it to progress. So Africa really stands a chance.
Thank you, Carlos. One last question, perhaps. You are a very important champion of the AFCFTA, yeah? And can I ask, as AFCFTA was being pushed by people like you and others, did you ever foresee it reaching this point so quickly? And second, what do you make of where it is now, and what more do we need to do to make sure that we realize all of its benefits?
When I started really dealing with the CFTA, which was supposed to be one of the outcomes of the Abuja Treaty, mm-hmm. It was signed in 1991, the Abuja Treaty for regional integration of the continent. And until 2012, there was only one ministerial trade ministerial meeting to discuss the Continental Free Trade Area. Between 2012 and 2016, there were 10 such meetings with a target in mind, which was by 2017, we should finish the negotiations. And that happened. So the political momentum was brutal, and I think it translated into actually launching the Continental Free Trade Area in the middle of a pandemic in January 2020. So this is remarkable, but that's the political stage of the process. Then you need to, basically become more granular and more detailed in the various protocols that are negotiated. And I think progress has been made. Now the pace looks much more like other free trade area technical negotiations, so it's not going as fast. But I don't think we are actually losing momentum yet, but we can if, all these changes that are occurring because of the logistics in the world being now much more influenced by dimensions in trade that were not as present as before, like security, mm-hmm. environmental, etc. We may actually lose a bit of momentum if we don't embrace them fast enough and become sort of early adopters of these new developments. Now, what I have as a hope is that the Continental Free Trade Area is going to be an opportunity for industrialization of certain types that are very much easy for Africa to adopt if we are successful in the implementation of the common tariff. One of them is, of course, agro-processing, where you have this incredible demographics. You have the urban population growing at the speed that we have never seen historically. You have a middle class that is growing as well, so they will need to be fed. And agro-processing is much more easier for Africans to adopt than other more complicated global value chains. And they have much less intellectual property, for the matter, since we're talking about the subject.
Indeed.
So for a variety of reasons, it is the winner. And I think a common tariff zone will create incredible opportunities in this area and place Africa, maybe just ahead of many other countries in terms of competitiveness in this field.
Carlos, thank you so much. This was really outstanding and super interesting and insightful, as always, as all conversations with you tend to be. Yeah? I really am very grateful for all your insights. Can't wait till we meet in person. Thank you also for joining us today, and look forward to presenting another interesting person with perspectives on Africa's development at the next episode. Thank you so much, Carlos. Huh?
Thank you, Abebe.
Thank you.